Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Free Association. What I'm going to do this evening is play a video from BitChute, a movie that was made by Dawson a couple of years ago now, a few years ago. There's a two and a quarter hour version on BitChute, so I'm going to play about an hour of it and see how we get on. Do an hour at a time.
Of course, we're after Saddam Hussein. Bin Laden. He's isolated. Some terrorists say poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi regime is a threat to any American. There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has.
This isn't just a film about 9/11 and the wars that followed. This isn't just about the lies from the press and the Pentagon. It's about our world, and how information is conveyed, and how prejudice is fostered by deception. About how we are subjected to indoctrination and used and pitted against one another. To understand the massive military expenditures and how they are eating up so much wealth, the first hurdles we have to get over are the trust in the mass media and the stigma associated with the concept of conspiracy. Every time the CIA or any other intelligence agency does a covert operation, that's a conspiracy. It's a bunch of people getting together in secret to do something illegal and lying to everyone else.
In the Gulf of Tonkin,
They took the babies out of incubators. We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
There are a lot of strange conspiracies about many things, but that is not a reason to reject conspiracies categorically. For example, the Iran-Contra affair was a massive government conspiracy hidden from the press and public for years. It happened in my lifetime, and it involved billions of dollars in multiple countries. This was a case where one part of the government didn't even know what another part of the government was doing. Thousands of people were murdered. Multiple countries in Central America, as well as Iran and Israel, were involved. And yet it was kept as a total secret from the media, or perhaps by the media, for years. Not only was it possible to hide this from the public, but most of the government was unaware of the activities of a small cabal from within. Covert actions and deception in the press aren't irregular, they're normal. When patriots expose how blatantly obvious it is that there is a cover-up, regardless of how much evidence they have, the criminals' last refuge is to hide behind the stigma of conspiracy. They want you to ignore history in favor of belief based on authority. Purposely promoting the asinine obfuscates investigation, poisons credibility, and misdirects valuable time and research. State deception and conspiracy isn't rare, it's normal. Blindly believing your TV is irresponsible and it's stupid. There's nothing kooky or funny about covert warfare and assassinations. It deserves open scrutiny and sincere investigation. I'm going to show you some live clips about the truck bombings in case you never saw them, forgot about them, or don't believe me. And also pay attention to these live reports about explosions at the base, the lobby, the basement of the building. These are reports from eyewitnesses, survivors, firemen, police, and the FBI. This would all get a nice church-off whitewashing and be replaced by pancake theories on one extreme and disinformation ranging from everything from Bavarian death cults to space aliens on the other.
NBC's Pat Dawson is close to the scene of that attack. Pat?
Just moments ago, I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device. That is another bomb going off. He tried to get his men out as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after the first hit here, with the first crash that took place, he said there was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. According to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. The second device, he speculates, was probably planted in the building.
That's what some people are saying. Now,
Base of the South Tower.
I was under the impression that it was just the actual collapse of the building, but some people are speculating that. I mean, I didn't want to say that because.
So we united there. So maybe they had that was an incredible.
That was an incredible explosion.
That does not cause from a.
I agree with you. I think it was the third plane, but again,
no, it could have been something. It could have been something that was planted,
or a bomb planted in the building.
But as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
And you were working there?
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out. They saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, an hour later, we had that big explosion, but much lower. I don't know what caused that.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
Do we have Jim Smith available on microphone from Chopper 2 as he takes these pictures? Jim?
Yes, I am here, Michael.
Jim, tell us what's happening out there.
We just witnessed some kind of secondary follow-up explosion on the World Trade Center #2, the one that is on the south that is difficult to make out.
As effective as a bomb being dropped there. There were two bombs in effect. Commercial airliners flown into those two buildings, and they came down. We presume because of the initial explosion, there may have been secondary explosions as well that were detonated in the building by these terrorists.
That would put us about a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. That area has just been evacuated because police have found what they described as a suspicious device, and they fear that it might be something that could lead to another explosion. Obviously, there's a real sense of caution here on the part of police. I spoke with some police officials moments ago, Chris, and they told me that they have reason to believe that one of the explosions at the World Trade Center, aside from the ones that may have been caused by the impact of the plane with the building, may have been caused by a van that was parked in the building that may have had some type of explosive device in it. So their fear is that there may have been explosive device planted either in the building or in the adjacent area. Okay, I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother? Don't worry about me. We need to make calls right now.
We just heard another explosion. Yeah, and they got gloves and masks.
I think a bomb went off in the lobby first, then a plane hit the building, then another plane hit the other building. But when I was coming through the doors on the other side of the Trade Center, either they blew the lobby up or something, because it blew the glass out of the doors and knocked us all down, and I got smoke and everything on me. I just feel a little shook up because I got blasted, so.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby. And even the turnstile was burnt and was sticking up, and they just told us to run. And as we were coming out, we passed the lobby. There was no lobby. So I believe the bomb hit the lobby first, and a couple of seconds in the first plane hit. And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb. It was just pounding, boom, 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 and I literally thought the subway had exploded and all the cars had been laying on top of it. Just so loud. I was actually in the subway heading towards the World Trade Center right around Franklin Street. And after the first explosion, the subway station started to fill with smoke. The subway cars started to fill with smoke, and the subways actually stopped. It was that he was in the lobby of World Trade Center 1 when the first plane hit. And when the debris started coming down, he went back to go into the building to protect himself and was in the revolving doors going back in off West Street when he looked up and a fireball came flying out and blew out all the windows and threw him back onto the street.
Once the plane hit the top, that's when the bomb was going off on the first floor. It's like the plane was actually hitting the first floor. You was hearing boom, 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 boom.
Explosion that was in the World Trade Center at about 8:46 a.m. in the morning. The explosion came from, I believe, at first we believed that it came from the mechanical room. And then we heard a series of other explosions that sounded up on the above levels of the building, to where we then realized that there was something wrong and there was a major problem.
What happened? There was an explosion. It was in the lobby, and then the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible.
It's like hell. You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the plan, probably.
Yeah, definitely a secondary explosion. We was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on our way upstairs, the whole fucking thing blew. And we just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
So was the first tower coming down secondary?
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second one, it was terrible. Then there was a third one, too, after that one.
Next explosion after that?
That's right.
And you were in
everybody was inside the building, waiting to go upstairs, and they just let loose. Everything just let loose inside the building.
So what you told me is that there was a plane that whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
There was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And they exploded. The whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
Right in front of our eyes.
Just like those least beautiful. It was so surreal, like a movie set.
Second and third explosions also. We were in the building for the third one. They collapsed. It was on this drive here from the other one.
This could be no worse than this. Could be nothing no more. You're in the building trying to help people, and it's exploding on the inside of the building. I don't think we get any worse than this.
Joining me is Jack Kelly. Now, he is a foreign correspondent. He has some information about these attacks. Jack, what can you tell us happened first in New York?
Apparently, what appears to happen was that at the same time 2 planes hit the building, that the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is still unconfirmed, but that is what the FBI is going on at this point.
The New York City Police Department has a report that the FBI is responding to New Jersey because a truck reportedly loaded with explosives has been stopped by authorities on the road there, and the men with that truck have been detained. Members of the Joint Terrorist Task Force, according to the New York police officials, are responding to question those people. I want to underline that all the phones to police headquarters and to the FBI from here seem to be disabled.
They stopped the truck. They found an entire truck full of explosives, and they arrested them. Those 2 men and their explosives are in police custody tonight, and another tragedy has been averted.
Still alive in the rubble in and around the World Trade Center. And word late tonight that 2 suspects are in FBI custody after a truckload of explosives was discovered around the George Washington Bridge. That bridge links New York to New Jersey over the Hudson River. Whether the discovery of those explosives has anything to do with other events today is unclear, but the FBI has 2 suspects in hand, said the truck load of explosives, enough explosives were in the truck to do great damage to the George Washington Bridge. But they arrested the 2 suspects, and they're questioning them as we speak.
And that it was near the George Washington Bridge. There were 2 or 3 men who were in the van. The van was pulled over. It is not clear why the van was pulled over, but when it was, law enforcers found tons of explosives inside of the van.
George Washington Bridge, Marcia.
Well, you know, Todd, it's really an amazing thing. Most of New York City's rescue operations and their police and fire departments have been concentrating their actions down in lower Manhattan, where the two planes hit the two towers of the World Trade Center. But some very intelligent and aggressive cops also stopped another terrorist attack from happening on the George Washington Bridge. CBS 2 has learned exclusively that 2 men are in custody tonight after being arrested at the George Washington Bridge with an entire truckload of explosives.
The FBI has now put out a nationwide APB, all points bulletin, for a white Chevy van with New Jersey registration. Written on the back is Urban Moving Systems.
There were at least 2, possibly 3 vans stopped by police on 9/11, and another 4th van spotted by a journalist. One had 5 individuals and traces of explosives. Another had 2 individuals and was packed with explosives. A 3rd van got away, and a 4th was possibly a diversion. The first van had been spotted earlier in Liberty State Park by a witness who saw 3 men celebrating and filming the World Trade Center attack. The timelines given by Sylvan Kirschberg and Paul Kirschberg, Yaron Schmel, Omar Mamari, and Oded Eldner were all over the place, and each had tickets to leave the U.S. with immediate travel dates to destinations all over the world. Oded Eldner, who had $4,700 stuffed in a sock, tried to lie to police about stopping for gas and claimed that he learned of the first explosion by telephone at 8 a.m. Problem being the first explosion wasn't until 8:45 a.m. Must have been a little nervous. Perhaps his greatest slip-up, though, was revealing that you could only see one side of one tower from the roof of Urban Moving Systems, so they moved to another spot with a full view of the length of both towers so they could document the event. Eyewitnesses had seen them already on top of the roof of their van, posing and taking pictures, only 5 minutes after the first plane crash. Urban Moving Systems is at least 5 minutes away. They were already on the roof of a parking garage in place, looking at the north side of the North Tower, which is exactly where the plane impacted. From the police reports, we gathered a helicopter for the local radio station AM 880 can be seen in the foreground of one of the photographs taken by the dancing Israelis, and the FFA traffic records show it was hovering over the Hudson River between 8:50 and 9:03 a.m. The Israelis took 76 photographs, and eyewitnesses also saw them video recording the event. They can be visibly seen smiling. Sylvan Kirschberg is even shown flicking a green lighter as if he was at a rock concert. Interestingly, Sylvan Kirschberg had been spotted in the Doric Towers the day before on 9/10/2001. He lied to 2 men in an elevator and said that he was a construction worker. He was positively identified in the police lineup. Both Doric Tower and the World Trade Centers were highlighted on maps of the area found in the van at the time of their arrest, and Sylvan admitted to the FBI polygrapher that he had been a map maker in Israel. Why would they have maps of New York with the World Trade Centers highlighted, as well as the place they were going to film and take pictures of the event from? Sylvan was also the driver that babbled on about Palestinians without any provocation to the police at the time of their arrest, and Yaron Schmel also lied to the police about their whereabouts, claiming that they were on the west side in New York on 9A.
The story that Feds build is a very good story. When you hear their story, you start even to believe it inside. Okay, maybe I'm a spy. I'm sure that I'm not, but the story is so good, so maybe I am.
What's funny is Sylvan Kirschberg was not one of the 3 later on an Israeli talk show to talk about being busted celebrating the attacks. Yet we know he was there because he's in the photographs. Omar Mamari was not supposed to have been there, yet he switched places with Sylvan on the talk show. Maybe because both the Kirschberg brothers were flagged as Mossad agents, and they were able to hide which 3 of the 5 had been busted celebrating the attacks, until in August 2011 Freedom of Information Act, which revealed the police reports. Because of the timestamp of the bolo, as well as reports from the New York Times and Fox, we know these men had been filming the entire event, which shows prior knowledge. Because of the matching license plates, we know that this is the same van later pulled over on Route 3 in East Rutherford by police. it had 5 individuals. Now, either the witness from Liberty State Park had not seen 2 of the men, or the 3 she did see had picked up 2 more. They were all Israelis, and had taken pictures of themselves flicking lighters with the burning World Trade Center in the background. The second plane had not even hit, and many assumed the first was a bizarre accident, but not these excited Israelis. They knew. Their van was traced back by its logo, Urban Moving Systems, to a front for the Israeli Mossad, Israel's CIA. 2 of the 5 men arrested's name popped up on the CFI and FBI's database as known Israeli agents. They had over $4,700 stuffed inside a sock and highlighted maps of New York and New Jersey. It gets even more interesting when the live reports report truck bombings as well as arrests. And then, this suddenly disappears from the media and the American conscience. Instead, we're fed images of dancing Palestinians. It's funny how Palestinians were featured dancing on every single channel when this was a false prepackaged tape, and yet the Israelis who actually were dancing on 9/11 never see airtime. The dancing Israelis who were working for Mossad front company Urban Moving Systems get caught in a van with traces of explosives. They were filming the 9/11 attacks in New York, with the planes crashing into the buildings, before it happened. So they just decided to set up a film on that particular day, driving around in a van that had traces of explosives. They just strolling through, put a camera, let's point at the World Trade Center for no particular reason, just in case something happens. And then, of course, 9/11 happens. After the police pulled them over and demanded they get out of the vehicle, this is what happened, and I'll quote from Counterpunch. The driver, 23-year-old Sylvan Kurtzberg, refused and was asked several more times, but appeared to be fumbling with a black leather fanny pouch type of bag. With guns drawn, the police physically removed Kurtzberg, while 4 other men, 2 more men had apparently joined the group since the morning, were also removed from the van, handcuffed, placed on the grass medium, and read their Miranda rights. They had not been told the reasons for their arrest. Yet, according to DiCarlo's report, this officer was told without question by the driver, "We are Israeli. We are not your problem. Your problem are our problems. The Palestinians are the problem." Another of the 5 Israelis, again without prompting, told the officers falsely that we were on the West Side Highway in New York City during the incident. Why did they automatically assume they were being pulled over because of something to do with 9/11? Why did Yarin lie to the police without being prompted and say they were on the West Side of New York when 9/11 happened, when we know they were not, as they were witnessed filming the first plane hitting and celebrating the attack, taking pictures of themselves and flicking lighters up in the air? What exactly were they hiding? They obviously knew the attack was happening. They were thrown in jail and they failed their polygraph test, but eventually they were deported back to Israel. Other Israeli spies were busted in several other states as well as Mexico, but nothing ever comes of it. Once they get arrested, the higher-ups always swoop in and deport them for visa violations. Some of the lower FBI and police are furious about this, but there's really nothing they can do about it. This event, damning as it is, has had a Lewinsky-style distraction effect, pulling attention away from the far more damning van stop near the George Washington Bridge, packed with explosives. Aside from eyewitnesses, the van bombs and arrests were reported by ABC News, CBS, CNN, Haaretz, Jerusalem Post, Fox News, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, the police themselves, Army Radio, several New Jersey papers, and so forth. Urban Moving Systems was only one of several fronts working that day, which also had prior access to the towers. These were not the only 2 mysterious set of vans stopped on 9/11. There was a 3rd truck, which was obviously a diversion, on King Street, which actually depicted a mural of a plane slamming into the World Trade Centers. And those 2 individuals were arrested. Obviously, this was a diversion to pull police in that direction, because no one would drive around in a truck with a painting of 9/11 on it on 9/11 unless they were purposely trying to attract the attention of the police to pull them in a certain direction.
With a mural painted of an airplane diving into New York City and exploding. So what's in the truck? The truck is in between 6th and 7th on King Street. I accept, I'll send the issue to the bomb squad, then full whiskey. Airplane diving into the air, blowing up. 2 men got out of the truck, ran away from it. We got those two bullets under. That's good. Did you get any further on those two guys over there? You all right over there, Jay? We got both suspects under, Jay. We have the suspects who could go with the van.
There was also an emergency 911 telephone call reporting that Palestinian bomb makers in a white van were headed for the Holland Tunnel. Unless they had a flag or something, I'm not sure how the caller would be able to tell if they were Palestinian or not. The caller, using poor English, said, "I see them at the airport mixing something, and they were dressed like sheiks, dressed like an Arab." This would have fit well with propaganda aired later in the day of dancing Palestinians celebrating the attacks on 9/11, which turned out to be a false tape. And of course, the only people driving around in vans for an intelligence agency who actually were celebrating the attacks and were caught dancing were Israelis. And the first words out of the driver's mouth were, "We're Israelis, we're not your problem, Palestinians are the problem." Apparently this idiot hadn't put it together that the plan hadn't worked out as smoothly as they had hoped. Ford also spotted another van with two individuals speaking Hebrew and taking pictures of the towers. The van must have been in the park before or just as the towers were hit, because the park was closed after the first tower was hit. It was one of the only vehicles remaining in the park. The two men lied and said they were Polish. The Israelis arrested on 9/11, who were driving around in vans that were a front for the Mossad, were detained and interrogated. They all failed their polygraph test. However, they were released by Chertoff and deported back to Israel and left alone. The owner of the Urban Moving Systems warehouse, Dominic Suter, along with his wife, fled back to Israel. The FBI raided the complex and confiscated over a dozen computer hard drives. This is a man who got a $500,000 loan just prior to 9/11, only for that year. And the FBI listed him as an official suspect of 9/11, and he remains a suspect. We got these leaked from Cryptomy. We also have copies of the Polish and Italian transcripts, but you definitely wouldn't have heard this on the mainstream media. He was allowed to return to Israel, and they have no interest in letting him go, and the press isn't going to push for it. The FBI classified what they confiscated from the hard drives. More than likely, it's sitting on the infamous S drive to protect itself from any Freedom of Information Act inquiries. From looking into Suter's financial records, we found that not only did the Mossad get him the loans for Urban Moving System, but also Aero Trucks, all of which were involved in the 9/11 attacks. Former FBI translator and whistleblower Sibel Edmonds uncovered that condemning foreknowledge of the 9/11 attacks was missed by the FBI. Of course, it's not hard to miss when you're not even looking. Rather than investigating her findings, her superiors at the FBI covered it up, and she was released. One document in particular of recorded conversations she uncovers shed more light about the full scale of the 9/11 attack in New York. In July of 2001, 2 months before 9/11, suspects were having blueprints of skyscrapers sent by courier to an obscure region west of Baluchistan. Not only blueprints for skyscrapers, but also building and bridge plans and composites. Details are in her book, Classified Woman. Not only were they interested in the buildings, but also a bridge. This fits with the people who had fake passes in the World Trade Centers, as well as those who were in a van full of bombs at the George Washington Bridge. It's also similar to the botched 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which consisted of a truck bomb at the towers and plans to blow up the Holland Tunnel. Funny how no one on the day of 9/11 thought of bringing up the Muslim Brotherhood, allegedly who solely was responsible for the last World Trade Center bombing, or even the 1993 bombing itself at all. Instead, the press compared it to Pearl Harbor and knew almost immediately that it was Osama bin Laden. Anthrax was also stolen from Fort Detrick, the same lab, just months prior to 1993's attack as well. And colleague Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind in 9/11, was the uncle for Ramzi Youssef, the ringleader of the 93 bombings, and he escaped and later bombed a plane in Japan. But let's ignore the long relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and the CIA, or how the FBI botched their supposed sting operation, which they never showed up for, even after providing the terrorists with explosives, or how another handler from the Mossad, Josie Hadass, whose apartment was the address for the Ryder truck used in the bombing in 1993, simply fled back to Israel. Just wiped 93 under the rug. Fortunately, since the cops knew what type of vans to look for, the George Washington Bridge wasn't blown. What I'd like to know is what were on the hard drives taken from urban moving systems. That's not reported. The truck bombs are never followed up on, and the massive spy ring is never aired. How did the Israelis know what was going to happen? What happened to the truck bombers? Why were the reports of the truck bombs never brought up again, and the investigations into the spy rings never got airtime? Why is that? Well, I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for the U.S. media to do an in-depth report about it. Anything that could involve Israel is off limits. They won't even report on a 40-year, very open, very verifiable military occupation of racial colonization and ethnic cleansing that could make conquistadors blush. Israeli bulldozers in Palestine making forced segregation so that fanatical Jews can live in pure colonies. Women and their children forced to leave their home. They can't live there. They're the wrong race. God said so.
Most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place. Brett? But the complaint about this system is that the wiretap computer programs made by Comverse have, in effect, a back door through which wiretaps themselves can be intercepted by unauthorized parties. Adding to the suspicions is the fact that in Israel, Comverse works closely with the Israeli government and under special programs gets reimbursed for up to 50% of its research and development costs by the Israeli Ministry of Industry and Trade. But investigators within the DEA, INS, and FBI have all told Fox News that to pursue or even suggest Israeli spying through Comverse is considered career suicide.
He told us the operatives had been instructed to ensure that the explosives went off at a point that was high enough to prevent people trapped above from escaping.
Now, according to the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, Flight 93 was only 20 minutes away from Washington, D.C., if it was going 580 miles an hour. The flight recorder stopped at 10:03 in the morning. That means they would have hit D.C. around 10:23 in the morning. However, had it been back to hit Building 7 in New York, it would have hit between 10:43 and 10:46. Interestingly, at 10:45, several news outlets reported hearing a fourth explosion at the World Trade Center in the smoke.
is to stay in your home, stay put.
And we just received the word that there was a fourth explosion at the World Trade Center. We have no idea what that was, if it was related to the first two explosions, secondary explosions from the first two, or obviously other attacks.
Some sketchy information here that another explosion, a fourth explosion out the World Trade Center has gone off. One doesn't know if that's an ancillary thing because of what already happened, or an additional explosion of some kind outside of that.
Rose, we hate to interrupt you. We've just been told.
A fourth explosion. Now in the area of the World Trade Center. Obviously, neither tower is still standing. We don't know the source of this fourth explosion.
One news outlet even reported that a 50-story building had collapsed.
That at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down.
Building 7 was 47 stories high. The timing fits and the size fits, but that building didn't collapse then. Even more interestingly is later in the day when the building actually did collapse, several news outlets again jumped the gun. The BBC report was so bad that they reported that Building 7 had fallen while Building 7 was still standing in the background of their report. A skyscraper housing offices for the CIA and, more importantly, the Security and Exchange Commission, investigating hundreds of billions of dollars worth of corporate fraud, falling straight down in a matter of seconds, isn't something you just ignore and skip. Both CNN and the BBC reported Building 7 fell before it had fallen.
We'll leave it there for the moment. We've got some news just coming in, actually, that the Salomon Brothers building in New York, right in the heart of Manhattan, has also collapsed. Many are saying it's the worst attack on the country since Pearl Harbor. A huge operation is underway to find survivors from the wreckage of both towers of the World Trade Center in New York. They collapsed after hijacked airliners with passengers on board were flown into them. The 47-story Salomon Brothers building, situated very close to the World Trade Center, has also just collapsed. Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing, and indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were, and it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost...
Sketchy indeed. Way to jump the script, guys.
As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see
The 9/11 Commission's way of dealing with it was to not deal with it.
As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see
Don't worry, that disastrous report was just confusion. That's why they also lost their live feed, coincidentally.
Almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Here it is.
I want to tell you that we are getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. I understand that this is a 47-story building.
That information, of course, take a look at that right-hand side of the screen.
It's going down right now.
There it is.
Yep.
It went down right there.
Now, it is very important not to over-exaggerate Building 7, as some have done, claiming there were only small pockets of fire. That is not true. That building certainly was on fire. The entire southwest corner had been eaten up. But that does not mean the building fell from fire. The southwest corner is where the giant hole is, yet it falls on the east slightly first and then uniformly drops altogether. And you don't get symmetrical collapses from asymmetrical fires. The argument that steel buildings had never fallen from fire is also disingenuous or silly, because in other fires, those buildings were not hit by airplanes, nor did they have buildings fall on top of them. Like the holes in the Pentagon or the debris from '93, weak arguments and disinformation are peddled on purpose to mask a greater deception. Too much focus has been on the minutiae of the building collapses, but Building 7 did fall uniformly, and it was reported by the media both in the UK and in the United States before it actually happened. It looked rather stupid without Flight 93 reaching its final destination for World Trade Center 7, but they had to do it anyway. There have been whistleblowers, of course, even from within FEMA, but who do they turn to? They can't go to the government with it, and they certainly can't go to the mainstream media with it. So if you're asking why more people haven't come forward, how exactly would you like them to do that? Go to who? And say what? Same as the hype for Iraq. You could scream until you're blue in the face, and it wouldn't be on TV. FEMA was responsible for the 9/11 cleanup. Oddly, they were positioned in New York on September 10th, the night before the attacks.
To be honest with you, we arrived on late Monday night and went into action on Tuesday morning. And not until today did we get a full opportunity to work the entire site other than the spot at Church and Day to which we were deployed.
FEMA, along with BPAC, gave some wonderfully silly cartoon explanations for how the towers collapsed. This administration seems to love cartoons. BPAC and FEMA, of course, worked together before on the Oklahoma City bombing cover-up. Managing emergencies meant controlling the crime scenes. Jet fuel, also known as kerosene, didn't weaken or melt any of the steel. And the mass media claimed that rocket fuel or jet fuel got the temperatures high enough to weaken steel on the truss and have floors collapse one by one like pancakes on top of each other, apparently with no resistance at free fall speeds as well. But here we have a woman standing in a hole next to the truss. She's not burned. She's got a towel or some papers or rag or something she was waving around. Apparently her hair and clothing and the paper or towel that she had in her hand must have been made of the same magic fibers as the passports that didn't burn.
Sally, go round the roses.
Also, in Washington, D.C., even though in New York, jet fuel could leave molten steel and metal in the basements of the building and weaken the truss to the degree to drop all their weight, same jet fuel from the same type of airplane couldn't even burn wooden stools, plastic computers, and paper books. That must be it. Things made of paper, like passports and books, don't burn in fire, but metals do. Welcome to bizarro world physics. To pretend that America's foreign policy is based on benevolence is outstandingly ignorant. To deny the actuality of covert actions and massive deception is equally as asinine. There are way too many counterexamples of successful conspiracies and hoax. The media doesn't report it. The media is owned by the Pentagon. They have overlapping board of directorates. It is one large corporation. They lie. With a profitable Cold War over and hundreds of billions in security fraud and a network of mediums to obfuscate off-the-books financing for covert and illegal operations under investigation, an event was needed to cover the old crimes and create the atmosphere for new ones. This wasn't for America or solely by American elements. It was multinational. Showing that 9/11 was done and why it was done and who covered it up isn't the same as how it was done. Of the 1,275 deaths in the North Tower, 943 were Marsh & McLennan or Cantor and Fitzgerald employees. The plane flew right into Marsh & McLennan's floors between 93 and 98. In the South Tower, 270 of the 490 deaths were from Eurobrokers Inc. and Aon Corp. We've seen airplanes and truck bombs, but what about the other explosions higher up in the towers? If bombs were inside, how could they be set in there with so many employees working in the towers? And who did it? You can forget about security, that's a non-issue. But exactly how and where could one place charges without anyone noticing? A good place to start would be the men arrested for fake IDs that granted them access to the towers to fix sprinkler systems, upgrade internet cables, move out furniture, and work on chronically broken elevators, especially when the Israeli-owned company they claimed to work for had no authenticity. Movers bring the goods, elevator and cable mechanics set them in place, maintenance shuts down the fire prevention system. Quick 3-step plan.
Any sense at all, have you heard anything even anecdotally from the cops about how many people managed to get out of the building before they collapsed?
No, absolutely not, but
There's also, I don't know if it was the case now, but I do know that one of the towers had a major elevator that went all the way to the top that was malfunctioning and has been malfunctioning for at least a month. They've been having a lot of trouble with that.
Aside from the mysterious elevator workers of the oddly chronically broken elevators and the Israeli movers contracted by Zim Shipping Company, itself partly Israeli state-owned, which broke a $50,000 lease in the World Trade Center to relocate to Virginia a week before 9/11, who else had suspicious access to the towers? In 2002, a simple case of fraud over fake IDs in Tennessee led to the arrest of 6 Middle Eastern men and revealed damning information about 9/11, about men claiming to have done work in the basement of the towers with fake passes. The key witness, herself an accomplice in the ID fraud, was killed a day before her trial date. Catherine Smith, the Department of Motor Vehicles employee, had been working with Khalid Otala from Jerusalem to provide Tennessee license, which do not require social security numbers, for 5 other men. The FBI, working on a tip, arrested Otala outside the DMV after he purchased the IDs from Smith. They had been monitoring Catherine Smith's house. She had also bought her car from Otala, one she would be found dead inside of later. The following group, Mohammed Fairs, Abdel Muhsin Hamad, Mustafa Abu Shahi, and Omar Kayata, were all arrested as they were also waiting outside for Otala to return from the DMV. The underlings told investors that Khalid, or Sakur Hamad, the cousin of Abdul Muhsin Hamad, could get the IDs. Oddly, the 2 ringleaders would be released while the underlings had the book thrown at them. Sakir Hamad, who had shared a residence with Otala Khalid, was arrested, and on his person he had a pass granting him entry into the 6 underground levels of World Trade Center 1. It was dated September 5th, 2001. Khalid Otala had also driven a truck from New York to Tennessee on 9/11. Hamad claimed that he had been doing work on the sprinkler systems for a couple of days, and that is why he had a pass. The problem with that, as Alan Hicks, the spokesperson of the Port Authority of New York, pointed out, the New York Port Authority handles its own work on such systems, and no one there had contracted Hamad. Hamad gave police a card for magic heating and plumbing. He also had a card at the time of his arrest. In court, his father produced a letter signed by Sergei Davydenko for Denko Mechanical, verifying both Sahira Muhammad and his cousin's employment. Davydenko told the New York Times Hamad had been working in the World Trade Center for him for a couple of days. The problem is, there was no magic heating and plumbing or Denko Mechanical. There was an obsolete business license for Denko, and the address for the office was simply Davydenko's residential address. Quite similar to the elevator operator's fiasco. One woman who may have been able to shed light on the entire matter was Catherine Smith, but the day before her trial, she had a car accident and died. Actually, her body had been burned inside her car, but the gas tank failed to ignite. Witnesses had seen Smith ablaze in her car, and investigators found gasoline in her clothing. FBI agent Susan Nash said Smith had been murdered. The unresolved questions about 9/11 and Smith's death had nothing outside of the circumstantial to do with the trial of her fake IDs, however. Hamad was released on a $250,000 bail. What kind of truck driver or repairman has that kind of money? Otala, the middleman, was released hours after being sentenced. Why was Khalid released? And why wasn't there a George Bush Sr. was the director when the CIA was preparing intelligence cells in Pakistan and Afghanistan to fight a proxy war with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Call them modern privateers. It's worth it to take the time to explain what a privateer is. Back in the day, when pirates were the great outlaws, a country could attack another country and risk war, or they could covertly pay pirates to do it, which would make them privateers. For example, if the British wanted to attack a Spanish ship coming out of the Caribbean, they couldn't do it with an English ship with an English flag because that could start a war. And at that time, Spain was really strong. So what they could do is pay off a pirate to do it. The pirate, who has a relationship to the royals, would be sharing their loot and paid by the state secretly. They would never attack British ships. They would only attack foreign ships, French, Spanish, whatever. And if a pirate attacks the ship and gets caught, they hang. No war. He did it as an individual. There's nothing they can do about it. This is a way the British could routinely attack Spanish ships covertly through privateers. All the Spanish could do was to continue to routinely capture individual pirates, try them, and hang them. And the British, of course, would act like they were trying to fight pirates too. The whole time, however, they had their own payroll with their own pirates who attacked who they asked them to attack. This system of privateering is exactly how our modern terrorist cells work. The United States and other nations payroll their own terrorist groups, such as Al-Qaeda. They'll attack the Russians in Afghanistan, they'll attack the Russians in Chechnya, they'll fight for us in Bosnia and Kosovo and wherever we tell them to, including the United States itself in a false flag operation. If a terrorist is caught or killed, so what? They're just a terrorist. But the fact that the CIA puts them on the payroll means they're our terrorists. They are modern privateers. You can look at Libya or Syria as an example. The U.S. paid off a bunch of Salafi jihadist religious nuts to go and do its fighting for them, and NATO did the air campaign in Libya. They couldn't do the same thing in Syria because of Syria's anti-air defense, but they have continually, through Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, multiple countries note, as well as the same Salafi jihadists they used in Libya, moved the terrorists into Syria, called them the Free Syrian Army, and are terrorizing Syria. These are known terrorists, real terrorist organizations, and the privateers were often real pirates as well. But there are portions of them, especially in the leadership, which are being paid off by intelligence agencies. And the money for this comes from the drug war, because Congress can't appropriate money to say, hey, we're going to go pay terrorists with that. Even the CIA likes to lie. You say, well, why would they lie? They do. They probably could have just said, F you world, and gone ahead and did a war in Iraq, but they didn't. They lied about weapons of mass destruction and mobile labs and Anthrax and yada yada. They're still at the point where they feel like they have to at least try to lie to us. And the CIA lies. Making everything secret also makes everything a lot more expensive and people more manipulatable. It's easy to control the middlemen this way. The opium from Afghanistan, it's used both in heroin and morphine, so legal and illegal drugs. But this money for the illegal drugs is where they're using the black budgets for the black operations to pay off our privateers to hit targets without having to risk our own soldiers. This is why on 9/11 it was so confusing and strange that the FBI and the NSA and our different alphabet soup organizations were fighting internally with themselves to allow certain terrorists to live openly in the United States and blocking investigations into them because they are our terrorists. There is a look-away list for our own privateers. Al-Hazmi and Al-Midhar are examples of this who had been used in the USS Cole bombing previously. Now it's up to you to think, did our privateers double-cross us, or was it the plan the whole time? You may ask, was that A, incompetence, because our government is incredibly stupid, B, benevolence, they planned the whole thing and they're genius and they pulled it off like that, or C, a portion of them know what's going on, majority of them are in the dark, and the faction puppeteering everyone else is using them because they surround themselves with dupes and incompetent people on purpose because they're easy to manipulate, and that's how our government works. I go with option C. This system of proxy wars and false flags and using mercenaries really escalated during the time of the Cold War. Because of the advent of the nuclear bomb and mutual destruction, the only way to really go to war any longer was to attack through proxy and to use mercenaries and to only attack nations that didn't have the bomb. Of course, they could be backed by other nations that did, which is why everyone is racing to get nuclear weapons As we can all see what happened when Gaddafi decided not to, he ended up getting sodomized by a knife. But if you knock out the drug war, and we're talking about $64 to $65 billion a year annually from opium out of Afghanistan, you would pull the plug on the finances for a lot of these black operations. And people can see clearly there is no grassroots revolution in Syria. These are paid-off mercenary groups. And each party and each faction have different interests for wanting to topple the regime. But if you think it's too complicated for multiple nations to get together and use mercenary groups to attack other nations or themselves, think again. Syria is a very clear example. Iran-Contra is another example where multiple nations got together, secretly created a lot of money selling drugs and weapons, and paid off mercenaries to fight in a third country, in Nicaragua. And 9/11 worked very much the same way. Our own Al-Qaeda attacked the United States with the U.S.'s own help, and it was covered up by the same intelligence agencies that started it to begin with. It acted as the pretext for the war on terror, which replaced the Cold War to justify all the massive military spending we've seen since, and the erosion of civil liberties and the rise of a despotic, fascist police state. Phase 1, secure Afghanistan, control the opium trade, which the Taliban had cut off. It's the Opium Wars too, just as the British had done before. The U.S. can create mass mercenary armies and foster and utilize terrorist groups at will. There's a reason Al-Qaeda has never attacked Israel. A war on terror is endless profiteering. The U.S. will have been in Afghanistan for over a dozen years soon. The objective has never been about winning, much less women's liberation or fighting for freedom. The whole point is to prolong conflict for as long as possible. This is why the U.S. preaches a war on terrorism while simultaneously engaging in acts of terrorism itself. And it doesn't matter if that's the slow boil by drones or by the quicker boil by privateer proxies. It could be Belhas in Iraq or Libya, MEK in Iraq and Iran, Jandala in Baluchistan, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Nusra in Syria, or the foreign aid RINA governments, which work in the same way as the privateer models, such as Al-Hadi in Yemen, formerly Mubarak in Egypt, Museveni in Uganda, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, Sheikh Sharif, Al-Khalifa, Franco, and so on, and of course, Karzai in Afghanistan. The U.S. began its Al-Qaeda Frankenstein back in the 80s by backing the Mujahideen and their mercenary special forces, Al-Qaeda, and then the Taliban and their civil war. And then the U.S. changed sides on paper to the Northern Alliance, but in reality it's just the CIA's occupation of the country for its own interests. The American government had a hand-in-glove relationship with Osama bin Laden while they were fighting the Soviets together. This privateer had a religious following and a lot of financial overlap with Saudi Arabia, who finances all of the extreme Wahhabi Sunni terrorist factions. Al-Zawahiri was much more of an influential privateer than bin Laden, but you never use your real puppet's face for the brand sold to the public. As Oliver North infamously stated, you must create plausible deniability. We wanted to be able to deny a covert operation. Plausible deniability. What he said here is so huge. Though the Iran-Contra operation in particular ended, that style of operation has been ongoing. Gladio 2.0 has been much in the same vein. There are a multitude of ways to launder money through Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc., through bogus NGOs, CIA-assisted narcotics trafficking, and fake foundations to create plausible deniability. Take the case of Fethullah Gulen, living in the U.S. as a preacher, but in reality, to anybody with any common sense looking at it, he's just a transparent conduit for the CIA NATO to funnel $20 billion worth of funds into so-called Islamic schools and mosques, which are themselves fronts for training the next round of RINA terrorists, a mixture of privateers and useful idiots. I want to stress that though naming names and documenting who said what and did what is very important, all of these neocons are exchangeable and expendable. The criminals change from one administration to the next, but the system, the MIC, the military-industrial complex, always finds new profiteers to pick up where the last ones left off. Though so many of these players are Zionist ideologues, it is only with the overlapping mutual benefits for military industries that these murder fantasies become realities. The MIC will always support the craziest, most racist, most bloodthirsty factions it can find, because they're good for business. Thus why PNAC's weekly standards prime financial sponsor was Lockheed Martin. Think of it like a car driving on a road. The road is war. The car is government. The financial institutions are the fuel, and the MIC is the driver. Each needs the other. But getting back to bin Laden, it's still important to hone in on this figure because he's so essential to the official story. And yet, he was supported by the U.S. throughout his career.
In the early 1980s, bin Laden worked with operatives from U.S. intelligence, the Pakistani military, and Arab states. They ran a wide-ranging covert network that recruited and financed Muslim fighters to battle the Soviet army.
These units were used again to finance 9/11 hijackers, who were under the protection by top officials of Chertoff and Goss, who intentionally stifled FBI attempts to investigate members of these cells, thus assuring 9/11's success. The question is, did the privateers double-cross the U.S. in a form of blowback, or was it jointly planned? It was planned and assisted. Not only were the bagmen who financed the operation protected, the hijackers themselves were relocated 2 steps ahead of the FBI, thanks to the Israelis' phone taps and monitoring of both the feds and the hijackers themselves.
Some American terrorism investigators fear certain suspects in the September 11th attacks may have managed to stay ahead of them by knowing who and when investigators are calling on the telephone. And what troubles investigators most, particularly in New York in the counterterrorism investigation of the World Trade Center attack, is that on a number of cases, suspects that they had sought to wiretap and surveil immediately changed their telecommunications processes. They started acting much differently as soon as those supposedly secret wiretaps went into place.
They also monitored the airports and planes. Those were needed to explain and justify the event. The assured damage was done by bombs within the buildings. As you already saw, bombs and bombers were found on 9/11. The bombers were released, and the steel from the building was quickly destroyed, shipped off to China and India. There is no way this was done simply as a double cross. No one but the government itself would have the means to do something like run a drill of the exact scenario of 9/11 on 9/11 to ensure that interceptors would be too far away and confused to stop the planes.
Hi, Boston Center TMU. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out. Is this real world or exercise? No, this is not an exercise.
Dick Cheney, vice president and husband of the president of Lockheed Martin and the leader of Project 908, purposely held back defense until it was too late to act. Bin Laden did not have the authority or power to force FBI agents off of his trail. Bin Laden didn't have the means to set up a false flag and steal anthrax from within American labs and take credit for it with his hijackers and associate it to Iraq to falsely lead America into believing that Iraq and Al-Qaeda were together and start a war there to bog down American forces. The U.S. and Israel did that all on their own. The notes sent with the anthrax read, "Death to America, death to Israel," automatically associating Israel's enemies with America's enemies. Because the attackers had written 9/11 and Praise Allah on the notes and mailed them from the same locations as the hijacker cells in the U.S., the anthrax attack was initially blamed on Al-Qaeda. The mainstream press never asked for evidence of the claims being made. They just repeated them obediently and blindly. Some were even dumb enough to take the Israelis at their word, as if Israel has never lied to the United States and would have no motive to implicate its enemies with such a tale. The London Times reported that Iraqis were seen passing anthrax to Al-Qaeda. Their sources were Israeli intelligence. Here we can see the beginnings of a setup. With this lie, they connected 9/11 to Iraq. Yet there was no meeting in Prague. There were no Iraqis passing anthrax to hijackers. There were no Iraqis even talking to hijackers. Next, Iraq was accused of making biological weapons, including anthrax, in mobile weapons labs. This lie came from Judith Miller, who wrote about it in the New York Times. Judith Miller, the girlfriend of the lawyer for the Mossad, Louis Libby. Here's a woman who tried to blame both the 1993 World Trade Center attack as well as the Oklahoma City bombing on Iraqis. She claimed that Iraq was using mobile weapons labs to hide their biological weapons of mass destruction and was capable of producing anthrax. Remember, Miller was also a journalist who got a hoax letter of anthrax. It's interesting because the postmark on these letters, which had identical notes as the real anthrax letters, were sent before there was reporting about them, as they had not been received yet. So why would warmongering Judith Miller and Fox News be sent pretend attacks, and yet real anthrax was sent to others who opposed the Patriot Act and the war? The formula is simple. 1. State Al-Qaeda attacked the U.S. with anthrax. 2. State Iraq has biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction, including anthrax. 3. State that Al-Qaeda met with Iraq. 4. State that Iraq gave anthrax to Al-Qaeda. All of these statements are lies, but it leaves the public with the conclusion that Iraq and Al-Qaeda were working together. Now, did Osama bin Laden set all that up? No. Osama bin Laden is dead. Later, neocons involved in the American-Turkish Council and the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee were fingered in illegal black market weapons trades, including nuclear material. Sybil Edmonds, the translator for the FBI, had the state secrets privilege enacted on her as a gag order. Every step has been taken to silence investigation, information, and legal action into these crimes. AIPAC was also caught spying on the United States, again. One of its moles, Larry Franklin, who was sentenced to 12 years in jail, was involved with the Niger forgeries, a bit of nuclear weapons propaganda, which fit nicely with Judith Miller's tubesmith.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
If you don't know already, if you've been living in a cave or getting all of your news from TV, these forgers were so sloppy that they didn't even fake the right name on the documents, and ignorantly used the name of a former foreign minister who had not been in power for more than a decade. It would be the equivalent of trying to pass off a modern document today and signing it Ronald Reagan, which is not even possible. This bogus information was used anyway, despite it being immediately debunked by the CIA. They knew it wasn't true. The CIA is evil, but they're not stupid. But it didn't matter, and they knew it wasn't going to matter. The press never took the 20 seconds or so that I just did to explain this, with the exception of Bill Moyers on PBS. All in one, you see the imperialists' intentional deception and sloppiness with the media's yes-man partnership. They can't claim incompetence when they're the ones faking the documents, and the media can't claim ignorance when they will not report on the matter even after the fact. They lie to you together. The mass media is just a pro-war PR machine for the Pentagon. Price office was passing classified information to Israel through AIPAC employees Keith Weisman and Steve Rosen. The man passing the documents, Lawrence Franklin, was sentenced, but the people receiving the information didn't get in any trouble after threatening to narc on everyone else who was involved, which included the majority of the Bush administration. Fife with Pearl set up something called IAI, the International Advisors Incorporated, in Turkey, to act as a miniature ATC. Fife was a sole shareholder. It is essentially just another bubble to profiteer through. It's odd how the U.S. wrongly points his finger at Iraq, and even Iran, accusing them of building nuclear weapons, and yet the real criminals trading nuclear secrets and possibly nuclear material are right here in our own government. Our Undersecretary of State and former ambassador to Turkey, Mark Grossman, is implicated in just such a crime. And even though he'd been caught red-handed with these dealings with the Turks and the Israelis, nothing could be done about it because the whistleblowers were gagged. To quote an old write-up from Justin Raimondo, one of the best muckrakers out there, immediately after 9/11, the FBI arrested a bunch of people suspected of being involved with the attacks, including 4 associates of key targets of FBI counterintelligence operations. Sibel heard the targets tell Mark Grossman, "We need to get them out of the U.S. because we can't afford them to spill the beans." Grossman duly facilitated their release from jail, and the suspects immediately left the country without further investigation or interrogation. That's the number 3 man at the State Department facilitating the immediate release of 9/11 suspects at the request of targets of the FBI's investigation. He's sourcing the Sunday Times, the same paper that Mordecai Benunu turned to break the story about Israel's secret nuclear arsenal. Unfortunately, Benunu landed in jail for that. It would be Mark Grossman who warned his associates to stay away from Brewster Jennings, a front for the CIA, particularly the wing which Valerie Plame was working for, which worked on tracking nuclear weapons proliferation. This became more public knowledge when Novak and Louis Libby told the world to stay away from Brewster Jennings and associates by ousting Valerie Plame as a covert agent. By ousting her, it was easy to deduce that the company she worked for must have been a front, and thus all of the CIA agents working for that were gone. They're pointing the finger at Iraq and Iran, but we know which country in the Middle East secretly has nukes. We know which cabal within the United States is selling this information on the black market, and it's in our own government. It's Fife and Pearl and Grossman and the same PNAC Zionist traitors that have led to the war in Iraq, helped cover up Niger, ousted Valerie Plame, and blackmailed politicians for their own financial interest. And who were the end buyers for these nuclear secrets? General Mahmoud Ahmed, the same man who wired $100,000 to 9/11 hijacker Mohammed Atta, and from the general would pass on to AQ Khan, and from there to all the black markets, I assume to the highest bidders. Not only were they selling nuclear secrets, they were also selling hooking points, soft spots for blackmail, to manipulate U.S. officials. Sibel Edmonds made valid complaints about a colleague who was leaking information illegally. Sibel gets gagged and released from her position, but the woman she complained about turns out to be the daughter of an official who worked for the general. And what happened to the other leakers? Well, Robert Novak would die, Louis Libby would have a trial, be convicted, found guilty, and then Bush just commuted his sentence anyway. And not paying his taxes. You know, it could really come full circle here with Rich's partner, Pinky Screen, and the DynCorp sex scandal, but I just don't have enough time to get into all that. That would take a whole separate movie. Sibel's 3-hour interview report in a SIP facility for the 9/11 Commission was redacted, and I'd say about 98% of it completely censored. She may as well have been talking to the wall, because none of that information was shared. They just wanted to know what she knew. Oddly, a male hooker, Jeff Gannon, who Karl Rove brought in, who was pretending to be part of a fake news agency, Talon News, made references to internal government memos about the Plame affair before they went public. This is a male hooker spending the night at the White House. I wonder how he got access to that information. And where was the ISI's general on 9/11? He was having breakfast at Capitol Hill with the director of the CIA, Porter Goss, and also Bob Graham from Florida, the senator for the Senate Intelligence Committee. Around the same time, Osama bin Laden's brother was having breakfast with George Bush's father to discuss business deals. George Bush Jr. was in Florida reading a book to some kids. Apparently, this book had a little television inside of it. They found the French filmmakers who caught the attack serendipitously.
Chief of staff, well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and I thought it was pilot error.
It's almost as if he had rehearsed what to say and royally messed it up.
Was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. The TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And
why didn't the Secret Service react after this second plane hit to get the president out of his publicly announced location if they were so worried about terrorism? And where was Mr. Dick? Dick Cheney was in a PEOC bunker making damn sure the next plane hit its target. Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta recounts.
During the time then, the airplane coming in to the Pentagon There was a young man who would come in and say to the vice president, the plane is 50 miles out. The plane is 30 miles out. And when it got down to the plane is 10 miles out, the young man also said to the vice president, do the orders still stand? And the vice president turned and whipped his neck around and said, of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary? Well, at the time, I didn't know what all that meant. And
the flight you're referring to is the
flight that came into the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Did Cheney order a stand down or a shoot down? Considering that he tries to lie about his whereabouts and the little fact that the Pentagon was hit, it shows that the order wasn't a shoot down, and the young man wouldn't be questioning the orders or quoting the miles either if it were. By default, the orders are to stand down until the proper authorities say to shoot down. Thus, the man was asking, are the orders to still stand by for orders to shoot? Because the plane is really close. The 9/11 cover-up or commission will claim that Dick Cheney didn't arrive at the Presidential Emergency Office Center until 9:58 a.m. They can't take a later timestamp than that because we have a photograph of all of them at 9:59 when the first World Trade Center was collapsing. This is a half hour after Mineta overheard the conversation about the plane being 50 miles out. This would place Dick Cheney there after the Pentagon had been struck. And they will claim the conversation about 50 miles out and 10 miles out was about Flight 93, not Flight 77. There's a big problem with that. If they were talking about Flight 93, Flight 93 was never 50 miles away, much less 10 miles out. Flight 93 went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, which is a hell of a lot further than 10 miles from D.C. Norman Mineta arrived at 9:20, and Cheney and Rice were already there. Richard Clark, the terrorism czar, stated in his book Against All Enemies that he arrived at 9:03, just as the second plane had hit the World Trade Center, and shortly after, certainly before 9:58, went into the Presidential Emergency Office Center to find that Cheney and Rice were already there. He recalls that later Mineta arrives at around 9:20 because they were looking for him. That means that Cheney was there between 9:03 and 9:20, if not earlier. White House photographer David Burr would tell Peter Jennings at ABC News that shortly after 9, the Secret Service came to Cheney's office and said, "Sir, you have to come with us." And Cheney himself said on Meet the Press on September 16, 2001, "When I arrived there in short order, we had word the Pentagon had been hit." So that's 3 eyewitnesses plus Cheney himself confirming that Cheney was there before the Pentagon was hit. Of course, the White House photographer and the Vice President gave these accounts before the Mineta testimony to the 9/11 Commission. Also, Condoleezza Rice and the Commission claimed that she arrived there shortly after Cheney. It would be an extremely narrow window for Rice to arrive after Cheney after 9:58. Yet all of them are there for the photograph at 9:59 of the World Trade Center collapsing. There is no way she had all those conversations with Clark and the principals within those seconds. Dick Cheney and Lee Hamilton are liars, no shock there. And the 9/11 Commission would delete Norman Mineta's testimony, however we recorded it from C-SPAN. It's hard to know where to start on 9/11. There's so many things wrong with we got attacked out of the blue because they hate us for our freedoms ignorance. Lying about why someone would want to attack the United States is bad enough. But then listen to the story of who allegedly attacked the United States. The media said it was done by 19 Muslim guys who conveniently left us a list with their names and plans on it, as well as not one, but 2 magical unburned passports. One discovered near Ground Zero by New York Police Chief Bernard Kerik, who is currently in jail for fraud. The other from Flight 93 of hijacker Zaid al-Jarrah, whose first cousin Ali al-Jarrah was later busted in Lebanon as a spy for Israel. They also left a nice, neat paper trail, complete with Korans left at strip clubs and bars by the devout Muslims. Some will say the list was left for their own fame, only that doesn't make sense because officially the list of names was in the luggage of Muhammad Atta, who was taking it on his final flight, and just by chance, his bag happened to not get checked in on his connection flight. Best of all, their leader, Osama bin Laden, who the U.S. intelligence agencies went out of their way to botch chances at apprehending, was said to be hiding in Afghanistan, a target of the U.S. well before 9/11. In fact, the U.S. already had invasion drills set in place prior to 9/11. Osama, whose name quickly became Osama, maybe to remove the USA at the front of it, was said to be in a high-tech cave in Afghanistan, plotting the next moves of Al-Qaeda. The high-tech caves, which Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said there were many of.
And there's not one of those. There are many of those.
And the Pentagon drew up cartoons for, didn't actually exist. In 2011, Obama announced the U.S. had found and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. No photos were released, and his body was dumped into the ocean.
Pakistan's on our side. Afghanistan is half and half. But right on that border is Osama bin Laden, most likely. And he's probably in Pakistan.
There was pre-written legislation ready to pass, and when it looked like it might not work, there was an anthrax attack to help push it along. This was initially blamed on Al-Qaeda, who oddly, even though they hate us for our freedoms, decided to rope Israel into the mix as well by declaring death to America, death to Israel. And just in case you forgot it was Muslims from 9/11, they also wrote Allah is great in 9/11-2001 as well. Which is funny because it would later be the Israeli security forces claiming to have witnessed a transfer of anthrax from Iraqis to Al-Qaeda at a meeting in Prague, which was impossible since neither Iraq nor Al-Qaeda had anthrax, and there wasn't even a meeting in Prague for them to meet in. How does one witness a transfer of something at a meeting that didn't take place between two parties that didn't have it? The target choices of the military grade made in the USA anthrax were interesting as well. The two senators against the Patriot Act, Patrick Leahy on the Judiciary chair in a position to block it, the other Tom Daschle, the Senate Majority Leader, also calling to investigate 9/11, were sent the lethal spores, whereas warmongering Fox News and Judith Miller, a WMD liar, were sent hoax anthrax, so they claimed. Despite all the anthrax story, it gets far worse. A letter written to the Department of Justice jumped the gun trying to frame someone for the attacks. The problem being, it was mailed 2 days after the first anthrax had been sent, but long before any of the letters had been opened or reported on. Worst of all, even though by December of 2001, the FBI knew it was looking at domestic terrorism, the anthrax myth persisted about Iraq, and Colin Powell used this scare tactic in his speech to the UN as evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, saying they could produce anthrax and kill thousands. Speaking about mobile weapons labs, a lie echoed by the now convicted criminal Judith Miller, who spent 85 days in jail over the Plain Libya affair, Powell said to the UN while holding a mock vial of anthrax.
For example, they can produce anthrax and botulinum toxins. In fact, they can produce enough dry biological agent in a single month to kill thousands upon thousands of people. And dry agents of this type is the most lethal form for human beings.
Cheney also reiterated this lie on Meet the Press, restating the same propaganda. The FBI ordered the aim.
I'm gonna stop it there, I think. I don't know whether there's still anybody in the room, but thanks for coming in. No, it's nobody there, so I'll close the room up now. And we'll do part 2 tomorrow probably.